Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Gabby Galliani, and I'm on the Greenhouse team. I'm going to be today's moderator. Before I dive into today's topic and speakers, I'm going to cover a few housekeeping items. Today's webinar will be recorded and shared via email. All attendees will be in listen-only mode. Attendees have two ways to connect. First, through your computer speakers, or second, by dialing in through your phone. Lastly, when questions do come up, please submit them through the Q&A box. We'll get to them at the end of the webinar, pending time. Today's webinar is brought to you by Greenhouse and Lattice, and we are talking about hiring and empowering managers to succeed. Today, we will cover the strategies for hiring managers and empowering them after they join your organization for about 30 minutes. Then we're going to dive into a fireside chat. Last but not least, we'll open it up to the audience for a live Q&A pending time. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce today's speakers. Today, we have Kristen Hayward, VP of Recruiting at Hustle, Elliot Epstein, Head of People Operations at Notel, and Jack Altman, CEO of Lattice. I'll let Kristen kick us off.
Hello, can everyone hear me now?
We can hear you.
Okay, I got the yes. Sorry about that, everyone. So first and foremost, thank you so much, Gabby, for helping us get started. I'm really excited to be here today and talk about one of my favorite topics, which is how to hire people managers. So first and foremost, I think anytime you want to be successful in a recruitment process, you do have to start with structured hiring. And when we think of structured hiring, the most important component of that is really that close alignment between a hiring partner and a recruiting partner, and starting with benchmarking the business objectives of the job. And only if we can benchmark the business objective of the job can we then design a deliberate process to be able to test and make sure that we find that right fit. So in particular, when I'm running structured hiring processes, I like to start with a process that I call design. I like to then align with the hiring manager, build a pipeline, and really bring in candidates using that structured process. And when I think of designing and aligning, one of the biggest mistakes that people make in hiring is they build job descriptions by copying and pasting other companies' job descriptions for what, say, an FP&A manager does, instead of actually take a step back and diagnose the needs of the organization with a 30, 60, 90, and 180-day plan. The later stage of a company you are, the longer out that plan is going to need to be. We're a post-Series B company, so we're really looking for that 6-month plan. And then once you have that plan, defining how you're going to measure success in the role, and also figuring out what the return on investment of a particular hire is. From this, you've now designed a role, and from that role, you can actually successfully kick off with a hiring partner. And from the role, say, if we need person to do X, here are the attributes we need a candidate to have to do that. The other thing that I think is really important about kicking off a new role is really understanding the diversity gaps that we're trying to fill when making this particular hire for our lead generation strategy. Here at Hustle, I've implemented a strategy that we call a diverse slate approach, where we look at diversity gaps both for the career level of the position, so manager, senior manager, director, and then also the specific team the person's going to be working on, like recruiting. And we make sure that in our lead generation strategy, we target that. And then last but not least, an important part of aligning is really setting those clear expectations for what each one of us needs to do to be successful in the role. And only once you've aligned can you then successfully build a pipeline of the profile that you've created in the design and align stage. A couple of things I think have helped be really successful. It's specifically in recruiting people managers. So one in particular is I like to ask ICs on the team, who are the best people managers that you've ever worked with that aren't on the team here with us at Hustle that we should try to recruit, and don't ever worry about us getting them. We'll definitely go after them together. I also like to ask business partners if they have leads and identify industry-specific networking groups. Networking groups can also be hugely advantageous in your diverse slate approach. And last but not least, I like to use tools for sourcing. Two tools in particular that have been really helpful for me. One, building out Booleans, and in building out Booleans, specifically prioritizing leadership job titles, manager or lead or director or head of. And then in terms of other creative ways to search, LinkedIn recently rolled out a great new language feature. So you can search for specific languages, again, to help with that diverse slate approach. And then when I'm thinking of great people managers, I like to look for companies that have been on best places to work list. I actually have a Boolean of that created because great companies have great managers. And once you feel really good about the pipeline that you've built, I like to run a very structured interview process. And I think a couple of things are really important. One thing that I think is counterintuitive to most people about hiring managers is you usually actually get a lot more inbound for manager roles. And if you're not really thoughtful and really tailoring down that pool from your inbound, you would have no time to really focus on sourcing passive talent and also making sure that you're networking appropriately for referrals. So actually taking the time and narrowing the pool at every stage is definitely important. It's important that you not see application review as a pass and a fail, but really, who are the best possible candidates in this pool for us to talk to? And how do we make sure that we're evaluating talent from a great pool? And then before bringing a candidate on site, I like to have a pre-brief, or sometimes called a kickoff. And I think a couple of things are really important. One, I think interviewers actually have the tendency to be one of the forgotten teams in the interview process. And companies generally don't give individual interviewers enough insight into the job. So as part of the pre-brief, I like to actually share the 30, 60, 90, and 180 day with every interviewer, have the hiring partner really give that elevator pitch to ensure, say I'm hiring a finance manager, and I've asked a people ops manager to interview, to make sure that the people ops manager really understands the vision for that position and can speak to it, and also understands why do we ask them to interview, and also how will they partner with this role. We're going to show up much more as a cohesive interview team if everyone has that appropriate context. Then I always like to give people candidate experience reminders and make it clear how the decision is made. And then coming out of the interview, I like to debrief once we've met a handful of candidates. And then I think a couple of things are important when we think about really assessing for managers. So the first one is Greenhouse has a really great interview kit and scorecard feature. I like to put in the interview prep section a couple of reminders on bias. In particular, a reminder that we are all biased, and what are some tips that we can do to help mitigate those biases before we go into the interview. And in particular, when we think about testing for someone at the manager level, I think it's really important to acknowledge we're really testing for 4 very specific things when we're trying to hire a people manager. The first is overall leadership, but also that alignment with the company values, and then a specific fit for the role. So a great example of this is here at Hustle, empowerment is a really important value to us. And so when we're testing, it's important that we find managers that are going to empower not just the people they manage, but also the stakeholders. And then say we are looking for that finance manager, that we're going to make sure that they have that core domain expertise. And then also equally important when we're hiring someone as a manager in a fast growing company, making sure that we're bringing in people to the company that we see as being a director for us one day. So as we continue to grow and develop our team, we do hire people that will have the opportunity to promote from within. Typically, when looking at leadership interview panels, I typically like managers and also directors to meet with 5 or 6 people. And one thing that I think is really important when hiring managers is to make sure that you're leveraging your peers in the interview process, and making sure, if you're hiring, say, a manager, that you're really leveraging your team of directors and senior directors to help interview them. And then also that you're involving your skip level manager, and we're really thinking about the overall fit in our broader talent bench. I'm a big fan of behavioral interview questions, and I like to provide in each interview kit, not just recommended behavioral questions, but also how we're defining specific attributes. In particular, I think one mistake people can make is they'll give the behavioral questions, but they'll not define, how are we thinking about the value of respect in particular, and you don't want your interviewers to have to guess what you mean, especially when you're looking for that key values alignment with the company. So actually providing indicators of that particular value or trait being assessed is especially important. And then last but not least, this is a sample of what a specific scorecard can look like for someone. And you'll see, it looks like the feedback on this particular candidate might have been a little bit mixed. Well, I'm definitely excited and always happy to chat more about hiring managers. Now I'm really excited to introduce Elliot to talk about, once you've hired that top talent manager, how do you empower them to succeed?
Great, thank you, Kristen. Nice to speak with all of you out there. So what I want to chat with you all about is how we can make sure that managers are contributing to a healthy culture of feedback by modeling that behavior at the top and demonstrating sort of authenticity and humility in terms of their own development so that their people can feel safe to do the same thing. So managers have to lead by example. One of the things that's often said in companies of any size is that the tone is set at the top. And so you cannot ask people to demonstrate behavior or values that you yourself are not willing to demonstrate. So managers have to first and foremost be solicitous of feedback from their teams and request it regularly. I think sometimes there's an assumption that if there's an issue, people will speak up, but it can actually be a challenging thing to let a manager know how you're feeling about them, especially if there's something that they could do to better support you or unblock things. So making sure that you're asking that question and creating a space in which it's not only safe, but encouraged to do that. And then a few things to keep in mind: responding with humility. So we as managers might think that we know everything on the plates of people who are working for us, but once you are not side by side with them every day and are not privy to everything that they're dealing with, you have to have humility around what you don't know. And so that leads to the next point, which is not having assumptions when you approach these types of conversations. It's really important to get full context and to not jump to conclusions. And then finally, listening is something that has to be done throughout. I think there's often an example set around, managers being great at presenting, managers being great at inspiring teams and public speaking and sort of being a face of the company. I think it is less often talked about, the importance of listening and recognizing what you don't know. So that gets back again to this idea of humility. So especially when it comes to feedback, and in order to create a great culture where people feel vulnerable and set up to do their best work, vulnerable in the sense, by the way, that they can be honest about what they're working on, not like they are under attack, obviously. Managers really have to lead by example. So a really helpful construct in terms of providing specificity and feedback, I stole from Life Labs. They're a great resource in case anyone out there hasn't heard of them before, definitely check them out. But they liken feedback to playing cards. So if you'll notice, the hearts and the clubs have rounded edges, and in both cases, there's no fine point on what the feedback means. So saying great job, or you crushed it, or you're a rock star, or you killed that thing doesn't really help anyone figure out what it is that they need to do again in order to achieve a similarly high result. So being much more pointed about what specifically contributed to someone's success. And if you get feedback that's vague in either direction, whether, that wasn't good or that was uninspiring or great job, you killed it, saying, okay, what held me back from being successful or what specifically made me effective, and being able to get people to give you a finer point on those things. So whether it's managers soliciting feedback from their direct reports and only getting vague answers or providing that feedback, specificity really, really matters. So sharing feedback. The first step, I think, is to make it a routine. It can often build and build, and if you only have feedback given once or twice a year in conjunction with performance reviews, it can start feeling like this very sort of big deal and heavy set of circumstances that people have to be nervous and anxious about. But if you actually have built-in structure in your weekly one-on-ones, say, let's give each other feedback on what we can do better to support one another, et cetera, it stops being as scary and it actually starts setting a really good precedent for relationships. So we actually use Lattice for this. In particular, we have a weekly update feature and you can customize the questions, but a lot of what managers ask their direct reports to comment on before they actually sit down for a meeting is, what can I better unblock for you? How can I make more of a resource for you, et cetera? So that by the time you arrive at the meeting, you've seen what their person has to say, you can respond to it, and then you can jump right into the conversation and be really purposeful and productive. And you don't actually need much more than 30, 45 minutes in the midst of a busy day to really drill down on how you can be a better resource and advocate for someone, and what feedback you have for one another if you've already laid that foundation within the platform. And then finally, closing the loop in writing. There can often be great feedback conversations that never get memorialized in any way. So being able to say, we talked about this thing at this time on this date, here's what I'm going to do, here's what you're going to do, let's make sure we revisit this. Lattice has a feedback feature. You can see a sample screenshot of people at Knotel using it here. So it's good to memorialize feedback with that, because it's then available to someone when they go in to write a performance review for themselves or for someone who reports to them. But it's also good if you gave constructive feedback or had a diamond, or rather, excuse me, a spade type of item for the previous slide that you were focusing on, to be able to write down what that is, but then go back in there and say, you know, in the last 2 weeks or in the last month, I've really seen this person make a concerted effort and I've seen a lot of improvement as a result. So one thing that we have started doing here at Knotel is Feedback Friday, and it's really a chance for people to get out of the office. And we unfortunately don't have a photo of people doing it at the coffee shop, but this is one of our pop-up spaces in and around New York City. And fun fact, I'm actually sitting in it right now. But what we do is we have an open tab at a few local establishments, and we say, go there, help yourself to a drink on us, and just give and provide feedback that's meaningful and constructive to a teammate who you might not get to do that with otherwise. So it's a good chance to see people outside of the office and a good chance to sort of have honest and upfront conversations. And I think it really helps people work together better and build trust, and also build camaraderie, which is important, obviously, to get a lot of stuff done quickly, which I know is a common mandate at many fast growth startup companies. So a few pitfalls to avoid when it comes to a feedback relationship. First of all, there's sometimes this notion, again, that managers only exist to provide feedback. They don't exist to be better as a result of feedback that they get from their teams. So make sure that it's multi-directional. And when I talk about vulnerability, again, saying, listen, as a manager, I'm working on these 3 things. I need to know if I'm getting better at them so that I can deliver the most I can to the company. And I'm going to rely on you to tell me how I'm doing. I think framing everything in terms of what is best for the company and how can we all be on one team and win sort of then disabuses people of this idea that feedback should only be in one direction. Another thing, you need some honey with the vinegar, right? I don't believe in a compliment sandwich in which it's here's one thing that you did well, here's one thing you can work on, and here's another thing that you did well. But if people only ever get positive, glowing feedback, even if it is specific, it won't mean very much, because it's sort of like you only tell me that I'm doing a good job. I don't know how to get better. Similarly, if everything that you provide to someone is constructive feedback, even if it's specific and actionable, it might not actually work in your favor, because they're going to start associating you with the person who never has anything nice to say and might not acknowledge the work that went into something. So make sure that it's a healthy mix of both. And that way, when you provide one or the other, it really will mean something. 2 other things to keep in mind, especially when it comes to managerial relationships where the weight of your words can mean so much. Focusing on someone's personality or disposition, or attributing an area in which you're giving them constructive feedback to something that is inherently true about them as a human versus a behavior or a specific action can start making people feel like they are judged on a very personal level and can sort of shut down the conversation. So even if they turn something in that has a bunch of typos and grammatical mistakes, calling them sloppy as a person is not going to be effective. Saying this document had many issues, let's talk about them, is both much fairer and more precise and takes the sort of personal aspect out of it. The other and final point that I'll get to is frequency. So again, making it part of a routine is key. There is this notion of seasonal feedback where it only happens in conjunction with a high stakes event like a review or a change in salary. You don't want to get into that habit. Review should actually be a recap of everything that's sort of been discussed throughout the year. It shouldn't be anything new. And I would just add one thing in terms of all of this, which is that the more senior you get in a company, the more important I think it is for you to actually get feedback from everyone on a regular basis. So, don't mistake a promotion as, I no longer need feedback from the people within my team, even 1 or 2 levels down. That's where I think a lot of people can really erode culture and trust. So again, it is not a matter of punishment. It is a matter of helping everyone be on the same team and do what's best for the business. And there's actually a real connection to this. A lot of studies by Gallup and by other sort of academic and organizational psychology type entities demonstrate that teams with a healthy culture of feedback that managers cultivate are more profitable, more productive, and lower on voluntary turnover. And again, managers have to demonstrate this at the top because it's even if you have someone who is trying to be a good example of it, if they aren't running a team or they don't have as high a profile of visibility in a company, it can start to feel like really swimming against the grain. So another big thing to keep in mind as far as setting teams up for success is the coach's credo of when a team is successful, it is because of their hard work, their focus, their dedication, and their commitment. When they fail, a manager should first look at themselves and say, what did I do to not set my team up to be successful? And I think giving as much credit as you possibly can and taking as much responsibility as you can is the thing that will win over the most trust. So a couple competencies of good managers that we actually evaluate people on, and these are things that are the basis of upwards feedback and sort of competencies around management that we share with all new managers at the company as well as the ones who have existed here. A lot of this also comes from Google's Project Oxygen, which is a really deep dive into what makes competent managers, but unblocking things that are stalling people from being productive or getting done what they need to, not micromanaging or sort of getting in the weeds. You don't want to turn a person who works for you into a miniature version of yourself. You want to unearth the best that they have to offer, but at the same time, being very clear about expectations and what good looks like. We use the objectives and key results framework. We also track that in Lattice. And so I think when someone on your team joins, being able to say, here are the 4 things that our company truly cares about. Often it's a matter of what is our product, who is our customer, what is our revenue, and what is our culture. That's one way of slicing it, but there are many ways, of course, you can do that. But being able to say, this is what we are working on as a company, here is how our team is supporting that, and here is what you as an individual should understand about how you are supporting our team and the company by extension of that. So it helps ground people in a sense of purpose. And then being, again, accountable for your team, giving them all of the credit and taking responsibility when things don't go well, because that will build trust. And I think it builds a sense of we're all in this together versus you are someone who stands to look good or not look good as a result of me. So also recognizing that when you become a manager for the first time, or even when you start managing larger or more complex teams, it is a particular skill set and body of sort of mindsets and approaches that need to really be cultivated. It's not something people are born with. So as a company, it's really important to cultivate skills with manager-specific trainings and to check in with people managers on how that is going. And it's not as if you are giving people information they've never thought about. More often than not, it's a way of giving them a construct or lens to view a situation or the act of management through their own experiences. Because people have perspective on what makes an effective and an ineffective manager, but helping them sort of channel that into their own behavior. And importantly also is to not assume that individual contributors who are great at one specific job will make great managers, or that someone who comes in from a different company altogether will seamlessly integrate and add to the culture that you've set at your own company. What sometimes can fly in certain sectors or types of businesses might actually be really frowned upon and hold someone back So being very clear about the things and behaviors that are valued, the company goals and priorities that you are trying to help support, and how the culture that you create on your team and the way that you manage your people will either enable that or, detract from its true potential. So a few key takeaways just to summarize when you manage managers. Make sure that everyone is very clear on the business, specifically the ongoing priorities, quarterly priorities, and what that means, as well as, if you're an agile workforce, which many of us are, how things change and why, and make sure that everyone who is managing a team is very well educated on all components of the business, not just them. At the same time, know what your managers aspire to do in their career in the long and short term. It might mean that they are being a team player and sprinting on managing a team that needed a home, but this isn't their long-term goal. Or it might mean that they want to be a COO someday and manage increasingly large and complex teams. But making sure that they feel you're invested in what they want to do and show genuine regard for that. And then finally, as we've said all along, making feedback routine, making it clear. One question that I love to ask and that I encourage everyone to ask, especially in a managerial relationship, is what can I do 10% better? So the more that you can weave that mindset into the culture of, even if we're doing well, we can always improve and we should never be satisfied with the status quo, I think that will make all of your managers and your teams more effective.
Great. Now we're going to
go ahead. Yeah, I think we're saying the same thing.
Thank you so much, Elliot. Now we're going to have a fireside chat with Jack. So passing to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And Kristen and Elliot, thank you for your insights and sharing your thoughts. I've found myself writing down notes, and I'm sure a ton of our listeners did as well. So I'm very excited now to go into our Q&A portion, where I get to ask each of you questions and go deeper a bit on some more sort of tactical issues and some stories that you might have. So I'm going to start with Kristen around the topic of hiring. And Kristen, first I'd love to talk about what types of questions have you found to be most successful when you're hiring specifically for manager roles?
Yeah, great question, Jack. So I think a couple of things are really important, specifically when digging into the people leadership characteristics. The first one, I love to get a sense of successes and failures they've had as a people leader, and what they've learned from them and how those things have helped shape them as a manager. And then two, I always love to get a sense of how they empower their teams to interact with other people across the org, to see if they're really building up a team of leaders, or if they're building up a team of people that are really followers. And then last but definitely not least, I always like to dig into how they've helped their team grow and develop, and what they consider some of their proudest moments as managers, to see, are they really excited by the idea of helping grow people's careers, and are they really motivators and coaches?
And when you're talking to managers about this stuff, are you looking for managers who have not made mistakes, or at least haven't made mistakes in a while? Or are you looking for managers to handle the question openly and honestly and something else?
Yeah, great question. So I'm really looking for someone that handled the question openly and honestly. If someone tells me they haven't made a mistake before, and this is actually just general in interviewing, not even just for managers, it tells me either one, they're not being authentic with me, or two, they're probably not very self-aware. Part of being a leader is making mistakes and learning from them, and using them to refine and to grow in your career. So I'm really looking for someone to have an honest dialogue with me about what they've learned and how they've developed since.
That makes a ton of sense. When you are hiring for manager roles, do you find that there's a longer source to fill time? And if so, how do you efficiently fill manager roles when you need them?
Yeah, great question. So first, I think it's very important to set expectations in the initial role alignment with the hiring partner around this. But I personally haven't found that it takes longer to source for managers on the front end of the process. We run a recruiting sprint process. We use a tool called TalentWell. So we have a pretty agile recruiting process here. And because of that, we're pretty focused on that build pipeline stage. Where I have found that the manager process can be a little bit longer is sometimes the calendar Tetris of getting people into interview that themselves are a little bit busier and it's a little bit harder for them to sneak away. And then two, the notice periods tend to be a little bit longer when someone is in a people leadership role and they do have responsibilities to hand off. So all things said and done, I do think it takes about 4 to 6 weeks longer between when we start the search and when they start. But it's not really in that pipeline building stage. It's more further down the pipeline.
So when you have these very important manager roles that need to be filled, but it does take a bit longer to go from the beginning of the process to, first day at the company, how do you think about the trade-off between hiring fast and hiring right?
Yeah, great question. So I am all about hiring the right person for the job, especially in a people leadership role. If you're hiring someone to be a people manager, there's a pretty good chance they're going to come in and layer existing members of the team. And if you have a great team, they deserve great managers. So I think it's really important to get the search right. One of the questions I actually ask in the initial kickoff meeting, if the position is open because someone is, say, leaving the company, I do ask them to think about what their contingency plan is for the next 10 to 12 weeks to make sure that the team that's going to be managed gets that support and development. And that way they really have a plan in place so they're not pressured because one of the worst things you can do as a company is, bring in people that you hired rather hastily instead of taking the time to find the right person.
I think one of the other challenges many of us have felt when it comes to hiring managers is when we have to layer an existing employee, meaning, bring in their new boss. Do you have any specific tips or tricks when it comes to, hiring in somebody's boss and making them still feel, valued and important at the company?
Absolutely. So I think it's really important that you as the person in the hiring position make a commitment to that individual, that bringing in this boss, one, you're going to hire someone that it's going to be like, oh, of course I report to this person. This person is, where I want to be, 4 to 5 years down the road. And then two, that you're not going to use this as an opportunity to stunt their growth. I'm a huge believer that getting in the right manager can actually be a career accelerator. Because if you get in the right manager, it creates someone for you to learn from. One of the worst things I think that companies do is confidential searches. It's a very small market, and people always find out. And the person deserves the respect to have that difficult conversation with you, rather than to hear because someone in their network was pinged about the job.
Yeah, I love that answer, and that rings very true for me as someone who has both experienced it on the sort of end of receiving a new manager as well as hiring one. And then I guess the last question I wanted to ask you around hiring was, how does your process change when hiring for senior leadership positions? So when you're thinking about VP or C-level positions and that process, what's different there versus with other roles?
Yeah, great question. So I think one of the key things, once you go VP or higher, the hiring partner should expect to be more involved in the initial stages. So for most of the roles that I'm going to be recruiting for, a recruiting partner on my team, we can usually handle most of the initial calls and the initial screening. If and right now, to give you an example, we actually are recruiting a VP or SVP of finance, and Roddy, who's our CEO, is actually taking those initial meetings and initial coffees with candidates because one, the candidates expect it, and two, it really helps us make sure that we're not wasting anyone's time because the fit there, especially at the executive level, is incredibly important. And then two, I think the other thing that's really important is when it is going to add links. So similarly, how when you go from associate to manager or director, you usually add about 4 to 6 weeks in terms of total lead time. A VP, SVP, or C-level candidate may need a 3-month lead time just to start. So you really do want to kick off that search about 6 months before you want someone to join. And it is going to be a longer process on the sourcing side as well, because you want to make sure that you meet a diverse pool of candidates. And the fit piece in particular becomes especially important when you're looking at someone to be an executive of your company. They really have to be closely aligned in terms of value and strategy.
Those are some great insights. Thank you so much, Kristen. I'm going to now transition over to Elliot and ask a few more questions. So Elliot, I wanted to start by asking, how do you make sure to hire people who add to your organization rather than simply replicating the existing traits and personalities that you already have?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, Jack, and something that I would echo Kristen's earlier comment on being very particular about what you need and how to ensure the greatest diversity within a team from the get-go. So you don't want to just hire a miniature version of yourself. I think you need to do an honest analysis of the team, almost like a SWOT type analysis of strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats, and figure out what do you need in terms of body of knowledge, in terms of skill set, in terms of sort of personality traits and dispositions, so that you don't have an echoing chamber to be reflected in the people that you bring on, so that their culture adds as opposed to just culture fits. I think the term culture fit is actually deeply problematic. And I think the much better term is someone who will embrace your values, because those sort of have universal resonance regardless of your personality type, but someone who will not be an echoing chamber and will really kind of push you to come up with new and better ideas and ways of doing things. And will, if you have a lot of people, for instance, who come from finance and no one who comes from an entrepreneurial background, approach things with a much different sort of lens. And I think many smart brains in a room sort of debating and discussing leads to better outcomes than people who just think about things in one way. So having enough shared ground in terms of values and orientation, but also enough differences by way of background and perspective and opinion to have that healthy debate.
I love that differentiation between culture fit and culture add. How do you implement that? Is that done at the panel, at the interview panel level, with the manager, at the company? How do you make that a reality?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think a few things. One, we have values that we worked really hard on. They're on our website. They're assessed for in all of our interview processes. And so talking to people about those values specifically and what's resonating with them, not necessarily did you just see the values on the website and did you memorize them, but what do they mean to you? And I think you get a lot of intel in that question and how they choose to answer it. Another thing that we often push people on is, what are your own sort of personal values or North Stars? And what are the things that you, regardless of what kind of sector or space you want to work in, forget about Notel for a second, what are the things that you must have in place in order to feel like you will be set up to do your best work? And another question that I'm personally very fond of is, obviously when you're interviewing, especially senior folks like the one Kristen was talking about, when you're interviewing people like that, they've done a lot in their lives, but I always want to know where people are less satisfied and still want to push themselves to grow. So do they have that internal kind of self-regulating feedback instinct as opposed to just being receptive to it from others? Because people who say, I might do a few things passably well and it's never truly held me back, but boy, if I were to get better at this, I would be much, much stronger and able to contribute at a much higher level to wherever I am. I want those people 10 times more than I want the folks who are self-assured of their abilities across the board. I think also when it comes to finding culture adds, getting people who can reflect very candidly on where they've fallen short in past careers. And when it comes to people managers, especially saying, if I were to ask the folks who you've managed in the last few years, what are one or two things you do really well as a manager? And what are one or two things you can do better? I think that degree of honesty and candor and self-reflection prompts you to get people who are constantly going to add, because people who add look at things with a critical eye, most of all themselves.
I love that. When we talk about managers improving, we always, want as a company to help people quite a bit, but we also know that people need to sort of direct their own growth. How can managers seek to improve themselves? What advice do you give to managers to improve their own managerial skill sets outside of, whatever they'll get just directly with their work?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's a few things. One, recognizing again that this is a distinct sort of set of competencies that might be unrelated to writing code or drumming up a sales pipeline or whatever their actual sort of job on paper looks like. So a few things. One, I encourage them to talk to other people in sometimes informal ways, but often in a structured setting. In past companies, I've actually brought together people managers for kind of roundtables and they take turns facilitating. But it can be a very lonely position and everything is a murky area or a gray area. So hearing from other people who are going through similar challenges about how they've addressed them and talking sort of organically about the best way to approach things that might not be totally linear or black and white is a big part of it. There are tons of great podcasts out there and tons of books and articles and resources. And we live in a very mobile-friendly world, obviously. So anytime you have a commute of more than 10 minutes, you can take it upon yourself to learn something new. Or, Work Life with Adam Grant, Freakonomics. There are tons of really great resources that can give people new perspective. And then I think being solicitous with their team, not in terms of just, oh, well, if you ever have anything for me, let me know. But saying, no, really, you're actually holding me back by not sharing what I can do better in a more forthcoming way. So if it's giving an anonymous survey, Lattice has a feature, as Jack, I'm sure you know, where you can anonymize feedback from direct reports, but a manager will still see it. If they don't feel comfortable at attaching their names to something, doing that. I think also you learn a lot from exit interviews, which is bittersweet, obviously, because the people who are leaving will no longer be there. But I have actually had a number of exit interviews in my time at Knotel and taken managers for people that just left the company out and said, I want to share with you, not with names attached, but some of the themes that have come up, because I'm not sure if you're aware of this. There's this, idea of you don't know what you don't know, but these are people's experiences. And I'm not saying this with judgment or to make you feel badly. I just want to make sure that as you bring on more people and we try to, 10x the company and what we're doing, you're acutely aware of the experiences that are in the rearview mirror so that we can learn from them.
That's great. And the last question I want to ask you before we hand it back over to Gabby for audience Q&A is, can you tell us maybe a story about the best manager you've ever had or a great management experience and what made that so great?
Yeah, a few come to mind, but I guess I'll actually have to give a shout out to my nonprofit roots. So I started my career at Teach for America, and then slowly pivoted over to tech, still have strong ties to education. But I would say a woman who managed me during most of my time there was remarkably talented at both figuring out what was on my mind, figuring out what motivated me, helping me see the broader picture and orient what I was doing to the greater goals of the business, giving me feedback in a way that was timely and unvarnished and not sugar-coated, but also fair. Being able to sort of say, hey, you're really good at this. Here's how we can leverage the things that you do well and get more sort of outcomes for the business with them. And here's how we can sort of offset the things that you might not do as well. But I think the biggest thing was just showing consideration for me as a person. I think she managed me in my mid to late 20s, which is a time in your life when a lot of things can change and there can be sort of a lot of learnings about being an adult. And I never at once felt like I had to hide what was going on in my life at work. And she was just exceptionally supportive that way, which made me feel better about coming to work because it was a place where I could sort of be honest and be candid about where I was and bring all that more of myself to the job.
Awesome. All right. Well, Gabby, I think we can hand it back to you.
Thank you so much. Okay. So we will use the last 15 minutes to go through any questions that came up on the Q&A. So I'm going to start going through them. So the first question that we have from Adele is, how do you deal with conflicting opinions on manager candidates when so many people are on the interview panel? So I think the scenario she's referring to is too many cooks in the kitchen. Kristen, can we start with you?
Absolutely. So one thing that I think is really important is not just setting clear expectations between recruiting and the hiring partner, but actually the hiring partner setting clear expectations with the interviewers as to how the decision will be made. And in particular, the way that I typically, phrase it to managers is, as a hiring partner, you're the ultimate decision maker here, because you're the person that will own the decision of bringing this person into the company and ensuring that they're actually successful for the 30, 60, 90, 180-day plan that we've built. So every single interviewer, we want them to weigh in to make sure that we do the 360 assessment. And we know, especially if it's a key business partner, their buy-in is going to help make that candidate more successful once they join. But when push comes to shove, the manager does own that decision. So if there are people that aren't as excited about a particular candidate, it's really evaluating the different trade-offs between specific skill sets and saying, okay, this person is really strong on this area, and we've identified some weakness in this area. If we haven't got to identifying weakness, we probably haven't done a thorough enough assessment. and the manager has to make the decision, and ultimately they have to own the decision and make sure that if there is an interview that voted no, and I consider no the default outcome of an interview, so I don't see a no as a bad rating, but more as a default rating. They do own making sure that person knows their feedback was heard, but that we're still going to move forward, and here's why. And I've typically found that that really helps. People want to know their opinion was heard. But as long as it's clear to everyone how the decision is made, I find most people are usually happy with the outcome.
Great. Elliot, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I would just say the too many cooks in the kitchen thing is real. And I don't think any hire, especially when you have this many stakeholders, can truly be consensus driven. I would say, one, making sure that you're speaking in competencies, because often, in spite of as much structure as companies try to put into place, people can revert to I like them, or I didn't like them, or I don't know if they'll fit in, which is all problematic and sort of coded language. So pushing again for specificity, like in the feedback playing card thing that I mentioned. And two, I would also say being very clear on how much authority everybody has, because the fact of the matter is you want to be as democratic as you can, but there are people where if they can't get behind a certain hire, that hire actually won't be able to be successful. And there are others who it would be good if there was immediate buy-in from the start, but it won't necessarily sink their chances of being productive.
Great. Thank you both. Okay, so the next question, how do you distinguish between following company process and best practices and micromanagement? I find for managers that this seems to be a difficult line. So Elliot, do you mind kicking us off?
Sure. So one of our values at Knotel is outcomes, not processes. And it's not to say that process doesn't matter, because obviously doing things correctly really does, but the refrain that I always give to managers who might be at risk of micromanaging or for whom I'm getting that feedback is, what is the outcome you're trying to get to, right? And within that outcome, it doesn't matter how the sausage gets made. And if it doesn't, and you're just micromanaging someone to do the thing that you know well, you're actually inhibiting their ability to show what they can do, because we don't want to hire clones of ourselves. And the whole point of bringing on people with new skills is that they can amplify a team's output. So you're actually holding someone back. And I think being unafraid of that conversation and willing to have it and engage and getting people to sort of see the benefits of not just having one approach to something is really valuable. On the other hand, if someone is micromanaging a person because trust is an issue and they don't trust that the quality of their work will be good, normally that's a symptom of a greater problem. And I think that merits further discussion.
Kristen, do you have anything you want to add?
I would definitely just second the thought around really focusing on outcomes, and particularly in my role as a people manager, I think that's one of the most important things that I can do is measure people and their success on the end result.
Awesome. Okay, so Kristen, let's start with you for this question. How do you attract good candidates for these types of roles?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think a couple of things are really important when searching for a people leader. First of all, in general, I think really performance-driven job descriptions, talking to the candidate and articulating what we want someone to accomplish in the role, instead of listing off and using words like, I really dislike the word responsibilities in job descriptions. Instead, I like to think of it as like ownership. Especially when you're looking for a people manager, you're really looking for someone to come in and own different parts of the process. So I like to take a three-prong approach to talent attraction in general. The first is about a third of candidates should come from passive candidate sourcing or outbound. And that's really doing those Boolean searches, really hitting up the LinkedIns of the world, and making sure that in your copy in particular, you're really appealing to the candidate intrinsic motivators. Lou Adler has a really great career motivators grid. And one of the areas I always like to focus on is the very upper rate, which is really that long-term strategic core attraction. And that's going to be the team, the company, the mission, because as a company, those are really our differentiators. Any company can offer free lunch, or any company can offer a $50 wellness credit, which we do at Hustle and we are hiring. But it takes, a really special company to be able to say, here's our mission. We really value diversity, equity, and inclusion, and here's how we're going to make you feel. So I like to lead with our differentiators in our outbound, rather than point out why we're the same as all of the other companies in the Bay Area. The second prong of the approach is really working your network. Here we call it the hustle network, and the hustle network doesn't just include employee referrals, but also our broader network span in terms of hitting up our VCs for referrals, asking our Salesforce representative if they know a great Salesforce manager for us. And then last but not least, making sure that we're really taking advantage of our inbound channels and using things like the LinkedIn postings of the world. And that really ties into having a great job description for those inbound channels.
Thank you. Elliot, would you mind weighing in as well?
No, I mean, I think she covered pretty much everything that I would say to that. I don't have a ton to add.
Okay, cool. Well, then let me give you a different question.
Sure.
How would you describe a great candidate experience with regards to the interview process specifically?
Yes, it's something that we always have to improve upon because the world is small. People talk to each other. I think Kristen has made the point about this being an extremely well-connected space and confidential searches being risky. I would say poor candidate experiences are also very risky, both because you don't ever want someone to walk away with a bad feeling, but also because reputational risk is real, especially with Glassdoor and so much knowledge sharing. So a few things. One, I think investing the time up front to be very clear on what each stage of the interview process sets out to achieve and being consistent with that. So that doesn't mean just building scorecards and structuring interviews. That's important. But also, how can you make sure early on that you have a work sample that's telling enough of what the person can contribute, and then an interview where they actually discuss their thought process and you're able to get a sense not just of who they are dispositionally, but how they solve problems. And then how can you structure an interview process where they don't have to make 5 individual trips to your office and then meet 5 different people for 45 minutes at a time during each of those trips? One thing to remember is that people are often discreet in job searches. So every time they have to rearrange their schedule to come in, it's an imposition. So making sure that you give people a clear lay of the land, that they know who they're meeting with, that they have a very clear sense of what that person is covering, that the interviewers are prepared, that the trial activity is relevant and time consuming enough so that they can produce something substantive, but not so time consuming that it takes an entire weekend. I think an hour or 2 is a good framework, and that you're limiting the number of trips that they take and showing regard for their schedule and their time. That is single-handedly the best thing you can do. I also think being very clear internally about what your recruiting team is doing versus what a hiring manager is doing when it comes to negotiations and communication, because the moment the two start contradicting each other, or you have a situation where a hiring manager is saying one thing that a recruiter isn't aware of, you're really at risk for the perception that the left hand doesn't talk to the right hand, and for a candidate experience to start to be compromised.
Thank you. Kristen, do you have anything to add?
I think Elliot made a really good point. Every single person walking into an interview room needs to know what value they're there to add into that room. So are they testing? Are they selling? And then I think the second part is, I think companies often forget that it's very much a two-way process if you want to hire a great candidate. So we're not the only one making a decision. The candidate is making a decision as well. So acknowledging that at every step in the process, and we actually don't call them interviews, we call them meetings. And we're very thoughtful, and every interviewer has a role to share information in addition to assess and collect information.
Great, thank you. Okay, I think we can probably do about one more question. So the last question, how do you weigh negative comments from a candidate's past managers, as those people could be biased or vindictive? How can I tell who to believe? So Kristen, I'll pass to you to start.
Absolutely. So I think that one of the most important things about negative feedback is how did the person learn from it? So in particular, when getting tough feedback about someone or a bad back channel, I like to ask the candidate, hey, if I were to ask someone that worked with you in X capacity at XYZ, what would they say and why? And what did you do well in that situation? And what did you wish you did better? And give them the opportunity to actually show me, one, maybe they know that they blew it in that interaction. And 2, how do they learn and grow from that situation? Because again, anyone that's been in business is going to have made mistakes. And especially if you're looking to hire someone that has 5+ years of experience. So what's more important is that they've learned and grow, and they're going to be a better, whatever the position is that they're going to be here for us as a result of that failure.
Great, thank you. Elliot, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I would just say the more that you can focus both on what they've learned and how they've grown, but also on material actions and behaviors as opposed to judgments. Again, if someone gives a poor reference, probably there was an interpersonal chemistry issue between them and the person that they managed, just as much as there might have been material performance issues. So really parsing those two things out. And then it's actually okay to say, what I'm really interested in is the quality of the work they did, the clarity of direction that they had, and what I can do to set them up for the most success here. And let me tell you a little bit about our company and the things that we value and the things that are most important. So if you can frame your reference within those parameters, that would be really helpful for me. I think redirecting and steering the conversation to be more productive while not skirting the issue that they're trying to surface, but handling it in a way that is balanced and diplomatic and professional is the right way to go.
Great. Okay, well, I just want to thank everyone for joining the webinar today. We will be sharing both the slide deck and a recording later. And thanks again. I hope you guys learned as much as I did.